On Christmas Eve, a little boy says to a billionaire CEO, "Hey sir, my mom told me. You left us." The man turns around in surprise at what he just. The streets of New York City glimmered with the enchanting spirit of Christmas Eve. Festive lights draped across storefronts, their reflections dancing on the wet pavement as a light snow fell in a gentle, carefree manner. Spirals dusting the sidewalks and blending into the hurried footsteps of last-minute shoppers filled the air with a sense of excitement. Rich with the aroma of roasted chestnuts and the cheerful sounds of carolers, it was a season for families to come together. Laughter and warmth surrounded him. Yet Edward Marlowe felt none of it as he stepped out of the towering Marlowe Industries headquarters, his breath forming short, visible puffs in the icy air. His custom, the tailored coat, was buttoned tightly against the chill, and the shiver that ran through me felt more like a spark of excitement than just the cold. Through him, he was leaving later than he had planned, but business always had a way of keeping things exciting. Not even for Christmas could the emails wait until morning, but they smile and nod at him. His driver was just running a bit late due to traffic or weather, which is understandable. Edward checked his watch, then scanned the street, his sharp blue eyes sparkling with anticipation. He found waiting to be a minor hurdle in his otherwise efficient and controlled life, leaning against the lamp with a sense of calm. After he pulled out his phone, he was excited to squeeze in a few more minutes of work. That's when he heard the voice. "Hey, mister." Edward glanced up and saw a boy standing a few feet away, the child, no more than 7 or 8, bundled in a second-hand coat a size too big. His cheeks were flushed with warmth. From the cold, a red knit hat perched playfully on his curly brown hair. Edward sighed. He wasn't in the mood for panhandlers tonight, no matter how small. "Yes," Edward replied, a bit brusquely. His tone was sharp, yet the boy didn't flinch. Instead, he stepped closer, his small face full of determination. Serious in a way that felt a bit unusual amidst the festive atmosphere, the boy asked, "Are you Edward Marlowe?" Tilting his head slightly, Edward's expression shifted as he asked, "What do you want, the boy?" He paused, choosing his words with care, and finally exclaimed, "My mom. You mentioned that you stepped away from us." And for a brief moment, it felt like the world paused. Edward blinked, his mind racing to understand the words as he gazed at the boy, then glanced around with a sense of curiosity, as if hoping to discover a hidden camera or a parent nearby, ready to share an exciting explanation. "It seems there's been a mix-up," Edward said, his voice steady yet cautious. "I'm not sure who your mother is." The boy shook his head, his expression steady. "She said, your name, Edward Marlowe. She mentioned that you departed from us quite some time ago." Edward felt a tightness in his throat. There was something intriguing in the boy's conviction as his wide brown eyes locked onto his own. As though seeking answers he wasn't quite prepared to share, he opened his mouth to respond, but the words seemed to elude him. Instead, he turned his gaze to the boy's worn boots, glistening with the fresh snow. "What's your name?" Edward asked finally, his voice softer now. "Timmy," the boy said, his tone confident yet curious, as if he was eager to discover what Edward might say. Next, Timmy Edward began to crouch slightly to meet the boy's eye level. "It seems like there might be a little misunderstanding." Timmy crossed his arms, a thoughtful expression on his face. Her face radiated confidence as she said, "You don't make mistakes. You left before I was born." Edward stood up with enthusiasm, brushing off imaginary snow from his coat as he worked to regain his composure. This was surprising. He didn't know this child, and yet the boy's words were like tiny, pointed reminders nudging at memories he had tucked away for so long. The name. Timmy tugged at something distant, like a melody that danced just out of reach, inviting him to discover its source. "Your mother?" Edward asked while glancing up and down the street as Timmy pointed vaguely. "Toward the end of the block, she's working at the diner," and his tone was bright. As if this revealed all the secrets, Edward followed the boy's gaze toward a charming little diner, its neon sign glowing invitingly, blinking softly against the falling snow. He felt a twinge of something new, perhaps unease or guilt. But "Timmy, I believe it's time for you to return to her. It's getting late, and it feels like the right moment. It's quite chilly for you to be out here alone." But Timmy remained steadfast, his gaze fixed on Edward, with a focus that made the man shift uncomfortably, asked, "Are you going to come with me?" The boy hesitated. He felt a strong urge to say no, to walk away and leave this peculiar situation behind. Encountering the scene behind him, He couldn't help but glance back at the diner, where the snowflakes danced playfully in his dark hair. His driver still wasn't here, and the boy's gaze was unwavering. "I can't, Edward," he said, his voice softer now. "I have somewhere I need to be." In Timmy's face, he fell, but he nodded as if he had anticipated that response, which is perfectly fine, he said, simply shoving his hands into the pockets of his oversized coat. With a determined stride, he turned and began walking toward them. In the diner, Edward observed as his small figure was quickly enveloped by the bustling crowd, watching him depart with a sense of hope. With a flutter of uncertainty in his chest, he reassured himself that the boy must be mistaken. But as he stood there, the cold seeping into his bones, he felt a flicker of hope from Timmy's words. "My mom told me you left us," when his car finally pulled up, and Edward slid out. He settled into the back seat, a sense of adventure in the air as they drove through the snowy streets, the city lights dancing by, igniting his imagination. Drifting back to the boy for the first time in years, Edward felt a spark of something he couldn't quite name, something that filled him with a sense of wonder. He reached for his phone and scrolled through his contacts, pausing on a name that brought back memories from over a decade ago. Claire. Edward's thumb hovered over the call button, but with a thoughtful shake of his head, he gently set the phone down. It was just a. He reassured himself that the boy was simply confused and that his mother had made an innocent mistake. Yet as the car carried him toward his penthouse, he felt a sense of anticipation in his chest, and for the first time for a long time, Edward Marlowe found himself anticipating the silence that awaited him. The drive to his penthouse was filled with a calm ambience, accompanied only by the gentle hum of the car engine as Edward Marlowe sat upright in the back. He sat with his hands clasped tightly together, gazing out at the snow-covered streets. The city was vibrant with the gentle blow of the winter breeze, of holiday lights, and Edward was lost in thought, his mind dancing elsewhere. Replaying. "My mom often reminded me about the encounter with the boy, saying you abandoned us, but I believe there's more to the story. Heard plenty of accusations in his lifetime. His business dealings, while bold, tended to invite them, but nothing had hit quite like this. It was surprising. Of course, he wasn't Timmy's father, but that adds to the intrigue. I didn't even know the boy's mother, but there was something about Timmy's eyes that felt so familiar." When Edward stepped into the serene, pristine luxury of his penthouse, the knot in his chest felt like a firm embrace. The sweeping views of the city, usually a source of pride, brought a different feeling tonight. He loosened his tie and poured himself a drink, the amber liquid swirling with a hint of excitement as his hand trembled slightly. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, gazing thoughtfully into the night, reflecting on memories. He'd spent years burying them, and now they were beginning to claw their way to the surface. He took a long sip, hoping to drown them, but it was not enough. Utilized the boy's face. The way he spoke with such conviction truly inspired a sense of excitement. Something profound stirred within him as Edward closed his eyes, and the years started to unfold. He found himself back in the cozy apartment where he'd spent his childhood, the wallpaper peeling and the scent of dampness lingering in the air. His mother worked 2 jobs to keep the lights on, and his father had been a distant memory for a long time. Before he physically left, Edward had discovered early on that he could always count on himself. And even during those challenging years, there was a glimmer of hope. Soleil. Edward could see her. It was truly delightful, her wide, mischievous smile and the sparkle in her eyes. Sparkled with life even when the world seemed determined to drag them both down. They met in college as 2 ambitious kids, with big dreams and empty pockets, while others spent weekends partying. Edward and CLA had spent their time building plans for the future. She believed in him when no one else did. She called him. He confidently claimed he could change the world. And that belief was accompanied by a cost. Edward was hesitant to invest in the memory that had beautifully shaped everything in that defining moment. It was a rainy afternoon in a tiny cafe where they always met. Claire had been holding his hand across the table, her thumb tracing gentle circles over his knuckles. She had a habit of doing that when she was nervous. "We're going to be just fine. Okay, Eddie," she said gently. "No matter what happens, we'll find a way to make it work. Together." Edward gently pulled his hand away, the words bubbling up inside him, ready to be spoken to Claire. "I've been offered a job, a real one. It's in New York," and her face had lit up with excitement. "That's incredible! I can't wait to go alone," he interrupted with words that sliced through the moment. Through her sentence, like a knife, the hurt in her eyes was immediate and raw. Yet it didn't deter him. He had been determined and confident that attachment was a liability. He reassured himself that he was doing her a favor by freeing her from the burden of his ambition. He hadn't stayed long enough to see how she embraced the pieces. Edward opened his eyes and downed the rest of his drink, the burn barely touching the ache in his. He had made his choice over a decade ago, and he had truly thrived since then. Success has been his constant companion, and regret has no place in his life. At least that's what he had always told himself. But now there was Timmy, a boy with brown curls and with a gaze that seemed to hold wisdom beyond his years. Edward shook his head and placed the glass down with a cheerful clink. It seems unlikely that Claire would have kept such a significant thing to herself. She was always open and honest, even in challenging times. Everything he's done, and as he paced the room, he couldn't help but notice a small flicker of uncertainty that had found its way into his thoughts. He sat down on the edge of the sofa and stared at his phone. The contact list opened once again to a name he hadn't noticed before. After years of contemplation, Claire felt a surge of excitement as his thumb hovered over the call button, ready to take the leap. Let out a sharp exhale and tossed the phone onto the coffee table, but he was ready to move forward. He couldn't just call her out of the blue. What would he even say? Hey, I'm at the boy who says I left him. Any chance he's yours? Just the thought of it brings a spark of possibility. His chest tightened, but Edward leaned back and closed his eyes, embracing the moment. Imagine the exciting possibilities. What if Timmy was telling the truth? What if CLA had raised a child? Alone because of him, the thought was like a splinter lodged in his chest. A challenge that sparked reflection and growth. He contemplated. Timmy's worm coat and his two big boots brought to mind the way the boy's face had brightened when he'd mentioned his mother's name. He envisioned the diner, its flickering neon sign shining brightly through the falling snow. Edward stood. With a sudden burst of energy, he grabbed his coat and scarf, ready to embrace the possibilities ahead instead of getting lost in what-ifs. He was on a quest for answers, and the perfect spot to uncover them was at that diner by the elevator. Red Down felt like a journey through polished metal walls that mirrored his furrowed brow and clenched jaw. But by the time he stepped forward, there was a sense of possibility ahead. Out into the snow, the streets had quieted, the hustle and bustle of the evening giving way to a serene calm. As Edward walked toward the diner in the stillness of the night, he felt a curious blend of emotions, excitement, curiosity, and something else he couldn't quite name. The snow crunched under his expensive shoes, each step bringing him closer to a past he had diligently worked to move beyond. As he reached the diner, he paused just outside the door, his breath visible in the crisp air, creating a charming fogged-up scene. Through the windows, he could see the cheerful outlines of patrons sitting at booths, the lively hum of conversation blending with the joyful clink of glasses. Plates. He scanned the room, his heart racing with excitement as he searched for a familiar face he hadn't seen in over a decade. And then I saw Claire. She was wiping down a table, her hair tied back, and her movements were unhurried, and while she looked older, there was no mistaking her essence. For a moment, Edward stood there, the glass door between him and a vibrant life he had dedicated years to building. Embracing this moment, knowing there's no turning back, taking a deep breath, Edward pushed the door open, the cheerful jingle of the bell above it announcing his arrival. CLA looked up, her eyes sparkling with surprise. Edward, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, audible over the lively chatter of the diner. Edward took a deep breath, his voice soft and bright. Hello, CLA. Claire stood still for a moment, her hand gripping the rag she'd been using to wipe down the table, and Edward shifted his hands with a hint of excitement, his coat pockets as he took in her appearance. She was a bit thinner than he remembered, her face lined with subtle details, traces of the years that had passed, but her eyes, those piercing, intelligent eyes, sparkled with promise, were the same, though now they held a cautious edge. What brings you here? CLA's voice was calm, infused with a sense of conviction, her words cutting through the hum of the diner. Edward hesitated, feeling the weight of her certainty. Unsure of how to begin, he glanced around, suddenly aware of the other patrons and the waitress who had paused mid. This wasn't the ideal spot for the conversation they wanted to have. Can we talk? Edward asked, his voice softer now, almost pleading. CLA stared at him, After a brief pause, they let out a sigh and placed the rag on the table. "Just a moment, please." She walked away, vanishing behind the counter. While Edward stood by the door, feeling a bit out of place but ready for whatever came next. Ever experienced a boardroom filled with competitors? The diner felt like a refreshing escape from the sleek glass and steel of his surroundings. Empire, it had the inviting aroma of grease and coffee, its decor a charming patchwork of faded vinyl. Chip tile, but it felt warm and vibrant, a delightful contrast to the sterile luxury he had. Grown accustomed to CLA returned a moment later, cheerfully slipping on a coat over her. In her uniform. She cheerfully gestured for Edward to follow, and together they stepped out into the crisp night air. The snow had slowed, and the streets were nearly empty. The city's usual buzz softened by the holiday stillness. She crossed her arms as they stood under the soft glow of a street lamp, her breath visible in the frosty air. "Talk," she said. Her tone was sharp, but Edward felt a spark of determination. He hesitated, unsure of how to begin, yet he had been rehearsing. This moment had been in his head since the boy approached him. But now the words felt a bit clumsy and inadequate. "I saw your son," he said finally. Timmy, Claire's expression shifted, her eyes narrowing. "You mean my son," she clarified. "What were you doing talking to him?" "He came up to me, Edward." He mentioned swiftly that I didn't go looking for him. He shared that I had left you, her. His laugh was brief and tinged with a hint of bitterness, but there's a certain truth in what he said. Edward couldn't help but react to those words. He had anticipated anger, but the straightforwardness of her tone surprised him. "I wasn't sure if I had what you needed when," she interrupted, her voice rising with excitement. "If you had stayed, I know you would have cared." "Please don't lie to me, Edward. You made it very clear. It was evident what your priorities were when you stepped out that door all those years ago." Her words resonated more deeply than he anticipated. Each one a reminder of the choices he made. "I didn't know about Timmy," he said, his voice softer now. "I wasn't aware there was a child." Claire's expression changed a bit, but she held her ground confidently. "Because there wasn't back then." Edward frowned, confused. "Then why Timmy's?" "Not your son," Claire said, her voice steady. "But that doesn't change the fact that you chose to move on, taking a step forward even when challenges arose. I imagine wonderful tales about you, the incredible man I believed you to be, Timmy." He overheard them, and in his mind, you transformed into the father who left him. Edward's shoulders drooped as her words resonated. Settled over him a sense of relief intertwined with a hint of guilt, creating a complex feeling that stirred within him. Unsteady, he felt the urge to protest and explain. But the look in Claire's eyes brought a sense of calm that silenced him. He said, after a long pause, "I didn't come here to reopen old wounds. I saw him, and I couldn't help but notice how much he resembles you, Claire." His expression softened for the briefest of moments before hardening again. "He's been through enough, Edward. We both have. I appreciate your intentions, but I'm focused on finding my own path and solutions without any external influences." Out of everything Edward said, his voice was steady now. "And I can help you. You don't have to worry to struggle anymore, Claire." She shook her head, her laugh lightened. "You think money. Everything gets better, don't you think? You haven't changed a bit." Edward took a step forward. Closer, his breath forming small clouds between them. "It's not about money. It's regarding doing the right thing. While I can't change the past, I can certainly ensure that Timmy has a brighter future." Claire stared. Her eyes searched his face, as if seeking the man she had once loved, and what unfolds when you discover. Feeling a bit weary of playing the savior, she softly inquired about what unfolds when one chooses to step back or when the next big adventure arrives. "When a deal comes along, you might feel like you can just walk in and fix everything, but life has its own rhythm, Edward. I'm not the same man I was," he said, his voice filled with hope. "Let me show you." Her silence stretched between them, full of potential and energy. She finally looked away, her gaze focused on a patch of snow-covered pavement. She expressed her uncertainty about trusting you. Gently, Edward took a deep breath, the crisp air invigorating his lungs. "I understand," he said, "but I'm not going anywhere this time." Claire looked at him, and then her eyes sparkled with hope, glistening with unshed tears. "I believe in the possibility of what you can do, Edward. I need you to leave us be. Timmy deserves clarity in his life," and her words were a bit sharp. But Edward nodded, sensing the determination in her tone. He understood he had no right to impose his will. way into their lives, not after everything. If that's what you want, he will make it happen. He said in a low voice, I'll respect it, but the offer is always there if you ever need it. Anything at all, please call me. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card, holding it out with a smile. She paused for a moment before reaching out, her fingers lightly grazing his in a fleeting touch. It felt like a spark, a beautiful reminder of the connection they once shared. Good night, Claire, Edward said, stepping back with a smile, turned and began walking away. The sound of his footsteps crunching in the snow, fading into the night. CLA watched him go with a sense of hope. Her grip tightened on the card as tears slipped silently down her cheeks. She was uncertain about what she had anticipated from this encounter, and the significance of it filled her with a sense of hope. Timmy's laughter rang joyfully in her mind, and she felt certain she would have the opportunity to explain everything to him. But for now, she stood under the street lamp, with the snow falling softly around her. As she pondered the possibility of change in people, the next morning, Edward sat in his office, deep in thought. At the city skyline, the encounter with CLA had left him feeling a bit unsettled. But he was ready to embrace the challenges ahead. Her words weighing on his chest, her refusal to accept his help sparked a growing curiosity in his mind. Even with her insistence that Timmy wasn't his son, a seed of doubt had begun to sprout. The boy's resemblance to CLA and the way he spoke with such conviction created an undeniable presence that lingered, making it impossible for Edwards to simply overlook. He decided to walk away, knowing that closure was essential not only for himself but also for the boy who had looked up to him. With a heavy heart, Edward reached for his phone and dialed his lawyer, a man skilled in navigating delicate situations, matters with precision and discretion within hours. Arrangements were made. A DNA test would be conducted, and the results would put the matter to rest. Later that day, Edward arrived at the charming apartment complex where Claire and Timmy lived. The contract between its the crumbling facade and his sleek tailored suit were stark, but Edward embraced it all. He knocked on the door, his heart racing with anticipation as he readied himself for another encounter. CLA opened the door, her expression shifting as she saw him. What are you doing here? She asked, her tone firm yet curious, body blocking the view inside. I need to talk to you, Edward said, his tone filled with assurance. Even with the tension between them, they had a conversation. Edward said to her, voice low, I thought we were done. This isn't about us, Ed.W. said with conviction. It's regarding Timmy. I'm eager to uncover the truth. Claire's brow furrowed as she tightened her grip, with determination on the door frame. I've already mentioned he's not your son, so let's find a way to clarify that, Edward said, holding up an envelope containing the DNA test kit. Let me do this. This is Claire. If the test shows he's not mine, I'll give you both the space you need, but if there's even a possibility that there's no possibility, Claire snapped, her voice rising. I don't owe you anything, Edward, not after everything. I'm not trying to take him away from you, Edward said, his voice softer now. But I can't overlook this. He deserves the truth, and so do I. CLA gazed at him for a long moment, her jaw set with determination. Clenched, she finally sighed, stepping back to let him inside the apartment, which was small yet tidy, brimming with delightful signs of Timmy's presence. Crayon drawings adorned the walls, and a toy car sits cheerfully on the coffee table. It was a home filled with love, and even though it was modest, it radiated warmth. Timmy was sitting on the floor, building a tower out of blocks when he saw Edward. His eyes sparkled with excitement. Recognition. You're the man from yesterday, he exclaimed, his voice a delightful mix. With a sense of surprise and excitement, Edward crouched down, sharing a small smile. That's right, Timmy. It's wonderful to see you again. Timmy tilted his head. His curiosity sparkled in the air as Edward glanced at CLA, who stood quietly by the kitchen counter, with her arms crossed. I was eager to have a chat with your mom for a moment. A little bit, he said gently. Is that okay? Timmy nodded, his attention already captured. Drifting back to his blocks, CLA handed Edward a small envelope containing strands of Timmy's hair. She didn't say a word as he took it, yet her expression conveyed so much more. This was a step towards understanding. It was a concession that came after a long journey. Edward left shortly after, the weight of the envelope in his pocket feeling like a new beginning. Heavier than it should. The test would take a few days, and while he dreaded the results, he also looked forward to the possibilities they might bring. Clarity. The days passed slowly, each one unfolding with a sense of purpose as Edward immersed himself in work, finding joy in the distractions that kept him focused on the future. When his lawyer finally called, Edward's hand trembled slightly as he picked up the phone. The results are in. The lawyer said Tim isn't your biological son, and those words resonated deeply. Edward believed he had convinced himself that this was the answer he desired, but hearing it aloud stirred something in his chest. He thanked the lawyer and hung up, gazing at the report on his desk with a sense of anticipation for what comes next. That evening, Edward found himself standing outside CLA's apartment once again, feeling a sense of curiosity and anticipation about what might unfold to return. But he understood the importance of addressing things before CLA opened the door. Her expression was a blend of surprise and exasperation. "What now?" she asked, her tone curious. With a sense of resilience, the test results arrived. Edward stated plainly, "He's not mine," while CLA maintained a strong posture. She relaxed slightly, though her eyes still held a hint of caution. "I mentioned that to you already, and I understand." Edward spoke softly, yet Claire paused, still filled with questions. Before stepping aside to let him in, Timmy was in his room, his laughter faintly audible as he played. Edward sat on the worn sofa, embracing the moment with a sense of purpose, eager to understand after you. As Claire began sitting across from him, I happily shared that I met someone else and we enjoyed our time together. It took some time, and I believed he would be there. But when I found out I was pregnant, he chose to leave, just like you did. Edward felt a twinge at the sharpness in her voice, but chose to remain silent, allowing her to express herself. Timmy is unaware of the whole story. Claire mentioned that he's still too young to grasp it, and I truly believe that. I wanted him to feel valued. So I shared stories about you and the incredible man you are. Before you left, I believed you were the father who walked away. Edward sat back, reflecting on her words. The ache in his chest deepened. But this time it wasn't just guilt. It was also regret, a longing for the life that could have been. He could have had for the boy who had looked up at him with such hope, ready to embrace the possibilities ahead. "Why didn't you tell me about him?" Edward asked softly. Claire shook her head, a hint of sadness in her expression, a smile tugging at her lips. She reflected on the choices made. "You were gone, Edward, having chosen your career, and that was part of your journey. In the Empire, it seemed there was no space for me, much less for a child." Edward had no reply, but that only opens up new possibilities. He had made his choices, and the consequences had spread in ways he could never have imagined. What he could have imagined. "I don't want your money," CLA said firmly, breaking the. "Timmy and I are doing great, and we appreciate your concern, but we've got it covered." Edward nodded, his throat tight. "I understand. And if there's ever anything, I can definitely capture Claire's gaze in a soft and subtle way. Just remember to stay true to your commitments." Edward left shortly after, the crisp night air refreshing against his face as he walked back to his car, the truth shining brightly before him. And even though it wasn't what he expected, it turned out to be exactly what he needed. As the car pulled away, he glanced back at the apartment with a sense of hope. Its windows glowing brightly against the dark sky for the first time in years, Edward felt a delightful stir deep within. He felt a yearning not for success but for connection. And he understood deep down that this wasn't the end of the story, it was only the beginning. The car ride home was calm, with only the occasional rumble of tires on wet pavement. Edward gazed out the window, the city lights blurring into streaks of gold, and read the truth gently embraced him, settling into the calm areas where dreams and confidence once flourished. Timmy wasn't his son. He should have felt relief, but all he could feel was guilt. Claire's words resonated in. "Your mind was set on your career and your empire, and there was no space for me. Let's embrace the journey ahead." Alone, a child, the parallel was impossible to overlook. Edward had spent his entire life has been a journey of seeking healing from the pain of his father's abandonment, and now he has the chance to break that cycle and create a new legacy. Way he felt he could have been there for Claire, and even though Timmy wasn't biologically his, the boy's view of him as the father who had walked away was more impactful than Edward was willing to acknowledge. He reflected on the boy's wide, bright eyes and the innocence in his voice as he asked why Edward had abandoned them filled the air with a sense of wonder, and he thought of CLA, standing in the doorway of that tiny apartment. She felt a sense of defiance and pride, shining brightly despite everything she had endured. Edward had constructed his life to eliminate vulnerability. Yet there was something about this boy and his mother that had touched him deeply. By the time he reached his penthouse, Edward had made a decision that would open new possibilities beyond the walls he'd so carefully constructed. He couldn't change the past, but he had the power to make a difference in the present. Even if Claire turned down his help directly, there were other ways to make a difference. The next morning, Edward sat at his desk. As he sifted through papers and files, his assistant Alice gently knocked on the. She opened the door and stepped inside when he called her. "I need you to take care of something for me," Edward said. Handing her a. Alice took a moment to glance at the handwritten list of tasks, each one quietly waiting for attention, with no names attached. Her brow furrowing slightly, she asked, "Are you sure about this, sir? Some of these are." "Absolutely," Edward interrupted. "Just make it happen." Alice nodded, her curiosity shining through. It was clear she had worked for Edward long enough to understand the importance of respecting boundaries. Yet this unexpected desire for anonymity was unexpected for a man who typically sought recognition for all his actions. She left the room with determination, the list clutched tightly in her hand. Over the next few days, Edward's small acts of kindness began to ripple through CLA and Timmy's lives, and it started one evening. Claire returned home to discover a letter from the electric company regarding her overdue utility bills. The balance had been paid in full. Confused yet relieved, she assumed it was some sort of error and tucked the notice into a drawer next, followed by the exciting repairs of the leaky faucet in the kitchen and the broken heater that encouraged them to huddle under blankets at night. The drafty windows that let the cold seep in all were gently addressed. Claire noticed the changes one by one, each repair feeling like a. On Christmas Eve morning, Claire opened the door to discover a large package waiting for her, a delightful surprise she couldn't quite explain. Timmy squealed with joy as he brought it inside, his little hands eagerly tugging at the wrapping paper. Inside, they discovered a delightful box of toys, cozy winter clothes, and a brand new pair of boots. At the bottom of the box, nestled perfectly with the toy, was an envelope containing a prepaid grocery card, just enough to cover with a week's worth of meals planned. Claire sat down at the kitchen table, holding the envelope in her hands. She felt a sense of anticipation about what was to come. It wasn't just a random act of kindness. There was someone behind this. And deep down, it feels meaningful. She had a feeling as she glanced at Timmy, who was happily absorbed in his new toy cars and chose to remain silent. She wanted to avoid giving him any unrealistic expectations. As he navigated the situation, Edward discovered a refreshing change for the first time in years. He embraced the opportunity to slow down. His mind was free from the weight of quarterly reports or expansion plans. Instead, he found himself wondering if CLA had noticed the changes he imagined. Timmy's reaction to the gifts and the smile that had blossomed likely spread across his face. The thought brought a delightful warmth to Edward's chest that he hadn't felt in years. Evening found Edward in his office, gazing at the blinking cursor on an email draft with anticipation. He had written and rewritten the message to CLA at least a dozen times, each version feeling just a bit off, whether too formal or too casual, with a sense of closure. He deleted the draft altogether and leaned back in his chair, ready for new beginnings. Some things couldn't be fixed with words, so he reached for his phone and called out, "Alice, is everything set for tomorrow?" he asked. "Yes, sir," she replied. "The arrangements have been made." "Good," Edward said with a small smile tugging at his lips. "Thank you, Alice. That'll be all." On Christmas morning, Claire and Timmy were greeted by a cheerful knock at the door. Timmy eagerly rushed to answer it, his excitement shining through. Standing on the stoop was a man in a crisp uniform holding a large wicker basket filled with delicious food and sweets. Handwritten note. Claire took the basket, her hands trembling slightly as she unfolded the note. The words were simple, yet they held a promise of something wonderful. "Wishing you and Timmy a Merry Christmas filled with joy." She gazed at the letter for a delightful moment before placing it down. On the counter, she felt a wave of gratitude fill her chest, though it was accompanied by a hint of careful consideration. Edward was making an effort, that much was clear, and she was beginning to consider the possibility of trusting him. Timmy, unaware of the situation, continued on his way. Mother's turmoil transformed into joy as she dove into the basket, pulling out treats with wide-eyed wonder. "Look, Mom, it's as if Santa came just for us." Claire smiled, feeling a wave of joy ruffling Timmy's hair. It's pretty amazing, isn't it? Timmy nodded with excitement, already tearing into a chocolate bar as he chattered excitedly about the gifts. CLA found herself thinking about Edward, the man she once knew and the man he seemed to be striving to become. For Edward, Christmas morning was peaceful as he sat alone in his penthouse with a cup of coffee in hand. He gazed out over the city, feeling a sense of wonder. Solitude felt more bearable. He understood that Claire might never fully forgive him, and he didn't expect her to. But knowing he had done something, anything, to make their lives a little easier was enough for now, and for the first time in years past. And Edward Marlowe experienced a spark of something he hadn't embraced in a long time: hope. The day after Christmas was a peaceful time for Claire and Timmy, as the gifts and food Edward had anonymously sent brightened their small space apartment with a rare sense of abundance, and Claire's thoughts danced around the notes signed with an unmistakable E. Hadn't told Timmy, who might be curious about how to explain Edward's sudden interest in their lives. The gesture was kind, yet it left her feeling a bit uncertain. A blend of attitude and a protective demeanor she couldn't quite let go of. By evening, the festive glow began to emerge, to transform as the weather shifted. Dark clouds gathered, and snow began to fall gracefully, covering the streets in a beautiful white layer. In a serene stillness, CLA stood by the window, observing the storm grow stronger. Timmy lay curled up on the couch under a blanket, unusually quiet. "You okay, buddy?" she asked, brushing a hand across his forehead. His skin felt warm, almost like a comforting embrace. Timmy stirred, but didn't open his eyes. "I'm tired, Mom," he murmured softly. Softly heard, CLA's heart tightened. He had held back his complaints before, but now it was evident. It was evident that something was amiss as she gently felt his forehead once more, confirming the fever that had been steadily rising. A sense of urgency began to. She quietly entered, knowing she didn't have a car, but the snowstorm outside was just a temporary challenge to overcome. Called for a ride, knowing that the nearest hospital was a bit far to walk in the freezing conditions. She grabbed her phone and she reached out to a neighbor who occasionally lent a hand. But the call went directly to voicemail. Her next choice was the diner, where she worked, but after several rings, no one picked up. Claire bit her lip, hopeful for a response. Determined to overcome the wave of fear, she knew she had to find a solution. Timmy needed help, and Mom, Timmy's voice was softly, opened his eyes, which sparkled with a distant light, and his cheeks flushed with fever. "It's all right, sweetheart," CLA said, gently infusing her voice with reassurance. I'm going to get you some help." As the storm raged outside, CLA set down her phone. With a flutter of excitement in her hands, there was one more call she could make, despite having sworn she wouldn't. She was on the move, feeling a bit stuck. She took a deep breath and scrolled to the number Edward had written on the card he'd left with the Christmas basket. She gazed at it for a moment before tapping the screen. Edward was sitting in his penthouse reviewing emails in the soft glow of his desk lamp when his phone buzzed, and he glanced at the screen lit up with Claire's name, and for a brief moment, he paused, filled with curiosity about her. "I had planned to call him, and if it was a mistake," he answered. "CLA," he said as her voice was careful, almost cautious, as she began, tight with urgency. I really need to reach out because Timmy's not feeling well. He has a fever, and I'm looking for some help. Get him to the hospital. The storm is coming, but I'll be there," Edward said, cutting her off. "Just give me 10 minutes. He ended the call, grabbing his coat and car keys, and headed for the elevator, ready to face the storm. Outside was fierce, but he embraced the challenge as the car descended. Edward. He called his driver and asked him to get the SUV ready, a vehicle designed for severe weather. Within minutes, they were on their way. On their way, the city was transforming under the storm's heavy grip, with streets momentarily deserted and visibility was low as the snow fell in thick sheets. But Edward leaned forward with determination. The passenger seat felt tense as he focused on the road ahead, while the windshield wipers valiantly tried to keep up with the rain. The snow was relentless, but he carefully warned the driver as the vehicle skidded slightly on an icy patch. "We're good, sir," the driver confidently assured him while adjusting the wheel as they approached CLA's building. Edward eagerly climbed out into the brisk wind and joyfully trudged through the snow to the front door banged as CLA opened it. Her face was pale and her eyes wide, with a hint of concern. Edward stepped inside, eager to find out where he was. Invitation. Claire pointed to the couch, where Timmy lay cozily bundled under layers of. His breathing was shallow, and his flushed cheeks stood out against his pale skin. "We need to move quickly," Edward said, kneeling beside the boy. He slipped an arm under Timmy and lifted him gently. "The boy is just starting to wake up. CLA, grab whatever you might need." "Let's go," CLA eagerly grabbed a small bag with Timmy's essentials before joyfully following Edward back out into the storm. The driver had the back door open, and Edward climbed in with Timmy cradled in his arms. CLA slid in beside them, pulling together for an exciting journey ahead. The door shut against the brisk wind as the SUV confidently navigated the challenging streets with careful precision, the tires crunching reassuringly. On the overpacked snow, Edward maintained his focus on Timmy, holding the boy close to share a special moment. His warmth made CLA watch them, her anxiety mingling with an unexpected sense of hope. Gratitude filled her heart, regardless of her feelings about Edward. His presence was undeniable at this moment when she needed it the most. The drive to the hospital seemed to stretch on, with the storm adding a thrilling challenge to every turn along the way. They arrived, and CLA was already out of the car, eagerly rushing inside to alert the staff. Edward carried Timmy through the double doors, his expression focused and his movements confident. A nurse quickly ushered them into an exam room where a doctor began assessing Timmy, and Claire stood by the bed, holding her son's hand with a hopeful heart. As tears welled in her eyes, Edward stepped back, giving her space, but staying close enough to offer support if needed. The doctor explained that it's a fever brought on by a viral infection. After a thorough examination, we are providing him with fluids and medication to help bring it down. He'll need rest, but he's going to be okay. CLA let out a shaky breath of relief as she felt the waves of emotion wash over her. She glanced at Edward, who was leaning against the wall with a relaxed demeanor, shoulders visibly relaxing for the first time since he'd arrived. "Thank you," she spoke gently, her voice quivering as Edward met her gaze with his familiar warmth. Stoicism transformed into something more inviting and open. "You don't need to thank me," he said. "I was simply doing what I felt was right." They stayed at the hospital until Timmy's fever broke and the doctor confirmed he was on the mend, which is exactly what they should have done a long time ago. Was stable by the time they returned to CLA's apartment. The storm was beginning to subside, and the city was blanketed in a fresh layer of snow. Edward carried Timmy inside and tucked him into his bed, the boy murmuring softly, but too drowsy to stay awake. Fully awake, CLA stood in the doorway watching Edward with a blend of emotions that filled her with anticipation. He finally turned to her, and she stepped aside to let him pass. "I should go, Edward," she said with a hopeful smile. Said his voice low. "Wait," CLA said, stopping him before he reached the door. "Stay just for a little while." Edward hesitated, then nodded. He took a seat on the well-loved couch, with his coat casually draped over the armrest, brings a sense of nostalgia for the first time in years. The silence between them wasn't heavy with resentment. Instead, it was filled with something delicate yet promising, like the first light breaking through a storm illuminated the hospital room, where the gentle hum created a serene atmosphere as Timmy slept soundly. In the small bed, his breathing steady and his color finally returning to normal, Edward sat on a plastic chair by. The window was open, his tie was loosened, and his coat draped casually across the back of the seat, creating a relaxed atmosphere. Was nearby perched on the edge of Timmy's bed gently stroking her son's hair, finding comfort in the tender moment they shared. It's understandable that neither of them had spoken much since the doctor confirmed Timmy was out of. The tension that had held them both in its grip was now replaced by a serene calm. And Edward watched them with a sense of hope. His gaze lingered on the gentle care CLA provided for Timmy, and it's clear that he's going to be just fine. "Fine," CLA said softly, breaking the silence. Her voice was steady, but her eyes sparkled with unspoken emotions. "Thank you for guiding us here." Edward leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He said, "You don't have to thank me." "Claire," said his voice low, "this is the least I could do." CLA looked at him. Your expression might have been hard to read, but you were there when it counted, and that's what truly matters. More than I can express for anyone else." Edward embraced the significance of her words, and the unspoken reference to the man who had stepped away from CLA before Timmy's arrival created a moment of reflection between them. They were uncertain about how to respond, But finally, he spoke, his voice softer now. I've made a lot of mistakes, Edward admitted, his gaze fixed on the floor. But I believe there's always a chance to learn and grow from them. I reminded myself that I was making the right choice by focusing on my career and building a meaningful life. But as I sit here observing you and Timmy, he paused, his throat tightening. I see how much I have gained. Claire's hands paused on Timmy's hair as she gazed at Edward, her eyes brightening just a bit. You inspire me. Edward, I believe you meant more to me than you ever realized, and when you left, I had to. Let's gather the pieces together. I understand, Edward said, meeting her gaze, and I truly apologize for that. I realize I may have been focused on myself and didn't fully appreciate what I was leaving behind, but I have a desire to change that. To make it right, Claire, for you and for Timmy. Claire's eyes sparkled as she searched his face. After a moment of contemplation, she let out a sigh, pondering the sincerity of his words. Leaning back slightly, it's a bit more complex, Edward. You can't simply reverse the. I understand the past, and while I can't change it, I'm here for you now if you'll allow me. Claire could respond as a small voice brightened the moment with Mom and Mr. Edward both present. Turned to see Timmy stirring in the bed, his eyes fluttering open. He looked at them groggily, a small smile tugging at his lips. His lips curled into a smile. Hey, buddy, Claire said, her voice soft and warm. How are you feeling? Better, Timmy murmured, his gaze drifting to Edward. You were here. Edward stood and moved closer to the bed, his movements gentle, as if he wanted to respect the moment. Timmy, he said gently, I wanted to make sure you were okay. Timmy blinked at him, feeling a sense of warmth and care. For a moment, he smiled, his expression brightening. You saved us. Edward chuckled, softly glancing at Claire. I believe your mom played a big role in the saving. And that brings me joy. I could help. Timmy shook his head, his small hand reaching out to grab Edward's. Absolutely, you brought joy to Christmas. Edward felt a warmth in his heart as he listened to the boy's words. Innocent proclamation. CLA turned her gaze, a gentle warmth spreading across her face as she tenderly wiped at her. For a moment, the weight of the past seemed to lift, replaced by the simple. The sincerity of Timmy's gratitude shone through as he expressed his thanks, his voice steady and unwavering. Drowsiness. You're truly remarkable. Edward's throat tightened with emotion as he gently squeezed the boy's hand. The true hero, Timmy, received the heartfelt compliment. You're braver than I could ever be. Timmy beamed with pride. He looked at him before his eyelids began to droop again, and within moments, he had drifted back to sleep, his breathing even and peaceful. Claire and Edward sat in silence for a while, the unspoken connection between them stronger now than it had ever been. After years, Claire finally spoke, her voice soft yet resolute. If you truly want to be in his life, Edward is committed to the long haul, ready to embrace every moment without disappearing again. Even when things get tough, Edward nodded with a steady gaze. I promise, CLA, I'm not going anywhere. Anywhere. For the first time in years, Claire allowed herself to believe him just a little. She didn't know what the future was uncertain. But as she looked at Edward sitting beside her son, she felt a flicker of hope as the morning sun broke through the hospital room's blinds, casting a warm glow over the small family. And for Edward, it felt like a moment filled with hope. Redemption is an unexpected opportunity to rewrite his story, one act of love at a time, in the days following their night in. The hospital was calm yet full of potential. Edward kept in touch with Claire, reaching out in meaningful ways. With small, thoughtful acts, he checked in on Timmy and brought him books and puzzles to enjoy the moment, and even delighted Claire with groceries when she shared that she hadn't been able to shop, yet gradually their dynamic started to evolve, moving towards something new and exciting. Something new. Something delicate but filled with promise. On the morning of New Year's Eve, Edward made a decision that had been brewing in his mind since the hospital visit. And now it felt like the perfect moment to act on it. It felt like the perfect moment as he dialed CLA's number, his heart racing with excitement. As he waited for her to pick up, hello? CLA's voice came through the line, warm and inviting, but with a sense of hope. CLA, it's Edward. I've been reflecting as he started to pace his thoughts. Penthouse. I would love for you and Timmy to join me for breakfast tomorrow on New Year's. I'm excited about the day. I'd love to have you both as my guests. There was a long pause on the other end. Edward said, I don't know. It's just breakfast. He quickly added, no strings, no. Expectations are just an opportunity to kick off the new year with a bright outlook. I assure you, Timmy will absolutely love it. He could almost hear her weighing the decision. Finally, she sighed. Okay, let's go for it. Timmy, the next morning, Edward's penthouse was transformed. He had worked with his staff to create a warm and inviting festive atmosphere featuring a magnificent Christmas tree, still sparkled in the corner of the grand living room adorned with lights and ornaments. And the dining table was beautifully set, with a spread that could rival any feast. Pancakes, waffles, eggs, fruit, and more. As the elevator doors opened, Claire and Timmy stepped into the vast open space, their eyes widening with excitement. Timmy gasped, tugging at his mother's hand. Mom, look at the tree. Claire looked around, her expression a blend of wonder and fatigue. Edward, this is quite something, perhaps. Edward admitted with a small smile, stepping forward to greet them. And it's a fresh start that I wanted it to feel like. Special Timmy rushed to the tree, staring up at it with wide eyes. It's like a wonderful adventure, he exclaimed. Edward laughed softly. I'm so glad you like it, Timmy. And there's even more. Magic awaits at the table. If you're feeling hungry, they sat down together. And the atmosphere gradually became more relaxed as Timmy joined in, chattered away about the decorations and how much better he was feeling. Claire watched the dynamic between Edward and Timmy, felt encouraged as she noticed the sincere effort Edward was putting in to connect after breakfast. Edward led them with enthusiasm to the sitting area near the tree. There's something I want to share with you both, he said, his tone filled with anticipation. Warm Claire, you've been spot on about many things regarding my choices. I've made mistakes, and while I can't change the past, I have the power to make different choices moving forward. Claire raised an eyebrow. With curiosity sparkling in her eyes, she wondered what kind of choices Edward would make as he leaned forward, with his elbows resting on his knees. I'm taking a step back from Morrow Industries. I'm excited to still be involved, but I've come to understand that my life has been centered around work for too long. I'm looking forward to focusing on new opportunities. He looked over at Timmy, who was happily engrossed in examining a shiny ornament, then back at Claire. I've also made the exciting decision to start a foundation. It'll be named after Timmy. Its goal is to support children and families in need, especially those who may be facing challenges. You both have Claire's eyes wide open, and for a moment she appeared to be pondering something exciting. Words, Edward. I'm not sure what to say, but you really don't need to say anything, right? Now he said softly. I just want you to know that this is all about understanding and connection. Make positive changes or find a way to reconnect with you all. It's about creating impact and valuing new beginnings. The opportunity I've been given, Timmy, hearing his name, turned to them with a bright grin. The foundation carries my name, and Edward smiled, saying, That's right, Timmy, you inspired it. Timmy's face beamed with joy as he dashed over to Edward, wrapping his arms around him in a warm embrace. In a warm embrace, you're the best. Edward's chest swelled with joy as he hugged the boy back, his heart swelling with a delightful mix of emotions he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. CLA watched them, her expression softening. She saw something genuine in Edward that she hadn't seen before, a man who was embracing growth. Timmy pulled back, turning to CLA with a bright smile. Mom, isn't this the best Christmas ever? Ever. Claire smiled, her eyes sparkling with unshed tears. It's definitely one to remember. Timmy glanced between the two of them, then joyfully reached out, grabbing Edward's hand with one of his own and Claire's with the other. With the other, you have to hug too, he declared with the purity of a child. Edward and CLA exchanged a glance, a delightful blend of amusement and a hint of hesitation sparkling between them. And then almost instinctively, they leaned in, their arms wrapping around each other. And Timmy in. A group hug filled the room with warmth, the soft rustling of the tree and the gentle sound of snowflakes falling creating a cozy atmosphere. The glass windows outside the city were beautifully blanketed in white, making the world appear enchanting. Still and peaceful as the three of them stood there wrapped in each other's arms. Edward felt a warmth he hadn't felt in years of contentment. It was the fulfilling joy of meaningful connections and experiences. The momentary joy of material success was genuine, authentic, and profoundly satisfying. For Claire, it wasn't about forgetting the past, but about embracing the potential for change, and for Timmy, it was simple. His family was together, and in his heart, It felt like pure magic as the snow fell softly outside, and they stayed like that for a moment longer, the promise of a new beginning lingering in the air. The air for Edward was the beginning of an exciting journey he hadn't anticipated. But now, couldn't imagine walking away from, and for Claire and Timmy, it was a reminder that sometimes even in the most surprising paths for hope to re-enter their lives as the snow gently fell, to fall gently outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, blanketing the city in a serene and pristine glow inside Edward's penthouse. The warmth of the moment wrapped around them like a soft embrace. Timmy's laughter bubbled up, brightening the stillness enveloped him, and his small hands held onto both CLA and Edward with a sense of determination. Hold them together. CLA pulled back slightly, looking at Edward with a warmth in her eyes he hadn't seen in a while. "Years, you've changed," she said quietly, her voice filled with a sense of wonder, with a sense of hopeful anticipation. Edward offered her a small, genuine smile as they prepared for the meeting. "Timmy, seeing you again brought back memories of what I've lost and highlighted the wonderful things I still have." Opportunity to create. Claire nodded, her gaze lingering on his face for a moment longer before turning to Timmy. We've been through a lot, Edward. But I believe we can find a way to work through this together." Edward felt his chest tighten, not with fear or guilt, but with an overwhelming sense of gratitude. "I'd like that, Claire." More than anything, Timmy, completely unaware of the significance of their conversation, eagerly tugged at their hands. "Can we open presents now?" he asked, his wide grin lighting up the room. Claire and Edward laughed, the sound joyful and uplifting. Blending into the soft hum of the crackling fireplace, Edward stood with a warm smile, offering his hand to CLA to help her up. He said, ruffling Timmy's hair as they gathered by the towering Christmas tree. Timmy dove into the pile of gifts with pure joy, pulling out colorful packages and exclaiming over each one. Edward and CLA watched him, their eyes occasionally meeting with a warm understanding. It may not have been a perfect picture, but it was genuine, and it was more than enough as Timmy curled up on the couch with a new book and the fire burned low. Claire turned to Edward, feeling a sense of possibility. "You know, I wasn't sure I could ever." She admitted that she can trust you again. "And seeing how much you care about Timmy is truly heartwarming." "Start." Edward nodded, his voice steady. "I'm not asking for forgiveness overnight, Claire. I'm excited to be here for you both in any way you need," she smiled, her eyes shimmering with emotion. "Is a wonderful place to begin." As night fell, the three of them sat together, the city lights twinkling in the distance and the snow gently falling around them. Against the glass for the first time in years, CLA felt a sense of peace she hadn't known was possible. Edward did too, experienced a refreshing sense of fulfillment that arose not from ambition but from connection, especially for Timmy nestled between. He shared his book with them, and it was a simple joy. He had his family, and for a little boy who believed in the magic of Christmas, which was the greatest gift of all. Beyond the snow continued to fall, but inside, the warmth of forgiveness, love, and new beginnings blossomed. Beginnings filled the space. It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was uniquely theirs. And it was beautiful as the snow fell softly outside, and Edward, Claire, and Timmy discovered themselves united not by perfection, but by the beauty of second chances. This story inspires us to believe that there's always an opportunity to transform, to heal, and to create something truly meaningful with those around us. Caring about forgiveness and love may not always be easy, but they hold incredible potential to transform even the most fractured relationships into something extraordinary. If this story inspired your heart, don't forget to like this video and share it with someone who might need a little holiday cheer. They'll appreciate your support and hopefully subscribe too. Join us on the channel for more heartfelt stories. We'd love to hear in the comments what family means to you. Thank you for being a part of this journey. Enjoy the journey, and we look forward to sharing the next story with you. Wishing you joyful holidays.